Quiet and bold. I like that. Usually the ones that can get things done. So it's perfect. Thank you and good afternoon, Juneau Chamber. It is great to be with you. It's great to be through a regular session. How about you? Yeah? What does that, I mean, what does that look like? It looks like we have issues narrowed down to just a few. But even more importantly, in this capital city, it is springtime. And that means a change of season, a change of opportunities. And thankfully, it means, it looks like this year and in the next year, maybe 100,000 more visitors coming to Alaska. It means the legislature joined me in funding tourism marketing fully to take full advantage of independent travelers' wishes and desires to be in a great location with their summer travels. So those are some positive things that are happening. I want to also highlight or spotlight an initiative that came from my office. We've been working on this for 3 years. It's a micro loan bill that passed. It provides critical access to capital for entrepreneurs to start up new businesses and also to take care of some inventory needs they might have in the interim season. Say, for instance, if you want to buy crab in the winter and hold it for a while. It helps mariculture business owners and halibut charter fishermen, for example. Lots of opportunity there that was not being utilized or maximized through traditional banks and credit unions. I also want to mention Representative Kathy Munoz for very important legislation that allows municipalities a lot more flexibility in creating tax incentives for land development when it comes to housing. That work that she did will be a big help to Juneau in making more housing available here. And other communities are going to benefit by having more tax flexibility. So I wanted to say good job to Kathy on that great effort. A couple of other things you should know about as far the road to Cascade Point. I'm told that the 3-mile stretch of Glacier Highway will be open to the public this July. Paving, yeah. Don't call my office if it doesn't happen. Call DOT. That's the schedule. Paving set for next year for that stretch. You've already read some of the capital projects that are coming into Juneau as a result of the legislative session, but I'll mention a few. Aurora Small Boat Harbor work, Glacier Highway reconstruction starting out at Fritz Cove Road, UAS dormitories, an infusion of $190,000 to UAS mining workforce development. And of course, you've already seen the news on the Fish and Game building renovation and money for the SLAM. And most of these appropriations are funded from oil and oil production. That steady stream of black gold that fuels our economy here and has for decades and still can for decades to come. And hold that thought till I come back around to oil taxes and how tax reductions lead to new production. From a statewide perspective, you could call this the education session, which I did, and there's a significant education package. But from my standpoint, the most significant change that has been completed this year was completion of the performance scholarship funding mechanism. I told you several years ago that if we incentivized greater educational achievement by telling our high school kids, if you take more than the minimums required, if you take more rigorous coursework, you can earn scholarships to Alaska universities and job training programs. That was something that we actually created the criteria for with the legislature in 2010. In 2011, we actually set aside $400 million, but we're not able to yet create the account and the payout mechanism for that. This session, we created the account with the legislature, the fund. It's called the Higher Education Fund. That fund will have the $400 million in it and will fund performance scholarships and needs-based grants in the Alaska Advantage program on a sustainable basis for time. So instead of having to dip into the general fund every year in terms of recurring revenues every year, we now have a sustainable way to pay for these performance scholarships and as well Alaska Advantage. Basically, it was a compromise was reached where 2/3 of the appropriation will go to performance scholarships and 1/3 will go to the Alaska Advantage grants. So Alaska Advantage grants is something we've been paying for already from the general fund, but as part of the mechanism, we now have in place performance scholarships and the method to fund them across time, which will create for you as business owners, it'll give you better educated employees over time so that you can compete better in this global economy. Just wanted to make you aware of that. Public safety, we made significant improvements there and strengthened Alaska's public safety. And I just want to turn first to our initiative to end the epidemic of domestic violence and sexual assault in our state. And I want to say thanks again to Juneau for the Choose Respect March and for everybody who participated in that. Raising awareness and Alaskans standing up and being proactive has a profound impact, and one that you can't even imagine just from taking an hour out of your lunch to participate. I had one, just an example, but I get anecdotes and stories weekly from around Alaska on this. We had one village, this year we had 123 communities participating. The year before we had 63 or 64, and the year before that we had 18. So we now have 123, 124 communities participating in Choose Respect rallies and marches, virtually all on the same day in March to raise awareness. One village, I got a report from, they put up a Choose Respect poster saying, join us at, I believe it was at the tribal hall. It had the poster with the time and date and everything. Just the simple act of putting up that poster caused one person in that community to make a plan to get out, seek help they needed. And they finally had the courage because they realized there were people in the community that cared about them. So don't underestimate the power you possess to actually just step forward for a lunch hour and confront this significant issue. We also, I also wanted to recognize again, and I've done this several times, but Coach John Blasco at Thunder Mountain, when he took coaching to a new level, and he has taken coaching to a new level when it became about more than just basketball techniques, when it became about raising and coaching boys to men, basically inculcating or coaching the values that are important in life as well as in playing the game. And I think that's going to be the next step. We're talking about prevention now, prevention efforts in the state when it comes to ending this epidemic of domestic violence and sexual assault. If we can get coaches around this state training and educating their kids on how to play the game with respect, whatever it is, volleyball, soccer, that's going to lead to home lives that do that as well, and individual lives where that's promoted in a better way. Because coaching has to be about more than winning. We learned that with prosecutors in Ted Stevens' case. It's not about winning. It's about winning well as a society and as an individual. That covers some of our prevention efforts. Better enforcement in the system. I made a promise when I came into office that we were going to fund 15 village public safety officers and the trooper support necessary, because we have still many communities in this state that have no law enforcement presence whatsoever. So you pick up the phone to call for help. You don't get it for 3 to 5 days in some of our communities. I said that has to end. So from about 2007 to today, the number of village public safety officers has doubled from about 46 to 100 now, with trooper support as well. So there are many more communities that actually have a law enforcement presence, and statistically, those communities have lower incidents of assaults and other criminal mayhem because there is a presence in the community of law enforcement. This year, the legislature passed our legislation creating stiffer penalties for criminals who target our state's most vulnerable citizens, our elderly, particularly in the financial world when they take advantage of our elderly citizens. And I called the legislature back to deal with an issue that has been hidden under the surface of our state, and one that I was not as keenly aware of until more recently, and that's human trafficking and sex trafficking. It's invisible. This trafficking is invisible to most casual observers. Most of us, I heard one law enforcement person in Anchorage say, we think about prostitution as being the world's oldest profession. That's kind of a nice way of talking about 14 and 15-year-olds who are coerced and are dependent upon their traffickers for money and for drugs that they become dependent upon, that become hooked upon. Nationally, if you think about this, a 14-year-old runaway is on average likely to be engaged in the sex trade because of being enslaved by a trafficker within 48 hours of being on the streets. When you think about our largest city, the executive director of Covenant House, Alaska, describes this as calculated torture. And I call it modern day slavery. And we would do well, and I believe the legislature, if they haven't already, will pass today our bill making sex trafficking and human trafficking the serious felony offense that it really is. It's not a misdemeanor, it's a serious felony offense. Moving on to transportation infrastructure. 3 years ago, I started a 5-year deferred maintenance program where we committed to $100 million each year. So now our departments can count on, like DOT, the university can count on a fixed sum of deferred maintenance money. Doesn't address all of the backlog, but at least they now have a more steady stream of funding to devote to that. A Roads to Resources funding initiative passed, opening opportunities for responsible development, including upgrades to the Klondike Highway out of Skagway. And then that brings me to the topic of, one of the topics of interest for the special session, and that's oil tax reform. The challenge is this: in March, Alaska North Slope production slipped below 600,000 barrels a day. It's on a steady decline with no new production on the horizon. And at prices over $80 per barrel, Alaska's tax regime works against us. At $80 per barrel and higher, companies can take their profit elsewhere, invest it, and get a greater return on their investment than here. It's no different than you or I looking at a bank and saying, well, this bank gives me 2% return on my savings account, this bank gives me 1%, I'm going to take my money and go to the 2% place. It's the same concept at work. And the question is, are we going to settle for status quo decline, or are we going to create a more competitive investment climate here in this state? And to me, the answer is self-evident, but I have run into a bit of a headwind. I proposed HB 110 last year. The House took it up, they made changes to it, and passed comprehensive tax reform. And when I say comprehensive, I mean for existing fields and for new fields. The existing fields are the ones like Prudhoe Bay, Kapparik, Alpine, the ones you've heard of that are producing oil right now, but at a declining rate. They also passed legislation incentivizing work in new fields, places where the drill bit has never touched. At the end of this session in 2012, the Senate passed legislation that gives some hope for operators in new fields, not in the existing fields, so that's the difference. These fields are fields that will come online within 7 to 10 years. So no new production, but the state will still have to write a check out for exploration incentive credits to the tune of $4 to $6 billion for new fields to incentivize that work, but we'll do it on declining production with no new investments in known fields, known reserves of oil. But I think there was a significant sea change in what the Senate did, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. And it's the reason why I called a special session and included this in the call. The Senate, in passing incentives to new fields, or for new fields, admitted, finally, that tax policy does influence business investment decision-making. 20-0. They sent that message. So, but they said that only applies for new fields. They said it doesn't, that same logic really doesn't apply to existing fields. So I took that Senate logic and I actually took their calculation for new fields and said if it applies to new fields, it ought to apply to existing fields as well. And that is the proposal that I put on the table yesterday. Because I think if tax policy can influence business decision-making in new fields, then why doesn't the same logic apply to existing fields? Well, some will say in producing fields, like Prudhoe Bay, Kapparik, Alpine, some will say, well, they're going to produce that oil anyways. But that's just not true. And if you think about it, you'll agree with me, I think. Most of us think that when an oil company or oil companies find a reservoir of oil, that they sink their wells and begin to drain it, and that they can drain it 100% of the oil. But they can't, and they don't, because oil that comes later, in this case in Prudhoe Bay and Kaparic, is then of different viscosity. It's mixed up with sands and rocks in different ways, so heavy oil and viscous oil. So a company will only pull a percentage of oil out of a reservoir, and then it no longer is economic to pull the rest out, because they can make a greater return on their investment by getting cheaper, easier to recover oil from Texas and North Dakota. That's what's happening on the North Slope. So really all I'm asking of the legislature is to apply the Senate's methodology and logic in a comprehensive fashion, not just to new fields, but across existing fields as well. It's not enough to say that we can get only new production from new fields while sending the message that more of Alaskans' oil can remain locked in the ground in legacy fields. Even if we make a small percentage change of accessing oil that would remain unlocked in an elephant-sized field, a small percentage change makes a huge difference for Alaskans in terms of our opportunity, our revenue, and new production across a long period of time, not just getting as much as we can now for what's coming out of the ground now on the decline curve. The goal is to make Alaska competitive again, bring in billions of dollars in new investment, jobs, and hundreds of thousands of barrels of new production. I think that's a good old-fashioned opportunity for Alaskans. Natural gas. So we have a natural gas line bill before the legislature. And I want to try to put it into the big picture context so you see the importance of it. In my State of the State, I set a couple benchmarks for moving forward on a gas line. I said we need to get Point Thompson resolved. That's a field that leases have been had by the company since 1965 or 66. They first found hydrocarbons in about mid-70s. Still not producing. Governor Murkowski, at the end of his term, defaulted the companies and said, you've been holding on for that for too long without producing anything. Make it work. To their credit, across the last couple of years, Exxon, for example, has invested over $1 billion in those fields. And with the litigation's resolution, other companies are now in as well for that investment. And they have specific work commitments to move forward and produce hydrocarbons from that field. So that was a huge resolution and significant for Alaskans, because in the next couple of years, you'll see billions of dollars of work going into that field that Alaskan contractors and Alaskans in general will benefit from. The second thing you saw in terms of our benchmarks is by March 31st, the major companies, Exxon, BP, Conoco, got alignment together along with TransCanada, with TC Alaska, on a project, a gas line project in Alaska to Tidewater under an AGEA-like framework. That's one track that's going on. There's a second track that's moving forward, and that's under the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. That track is an in-state gas line, so now we're talking about a very similar project to Tidewater in Alaska, but it's a smaller diameter line right now as it's currently constituted. That's the focus of this legislation in HB 9. The focus is to get the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation to an open season next year, second quarter, third quarter of 2013, where they can be on a parallel path with the other parties, with Exxon, BP, Conoco, and TransCanada, because they can be on a convergent path. And frankly, the third benchmark I set in my State of the State was that this track over here with TransCanada and the companies, and this track over here with Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation need to get together and talk about what work they've already done. For example, TC and Exxon have already done field work on 500 miles of pipe, and the state has paid for part of that, 500 miles through Alaska. AGDC doesn't need to repay for that, and the state doesn't need to repay for it if they can share information. But in order to be able to share information, we need HB 9 to pass and authorize them to not only enable them to get that information, but also to take them through to the open season next year. So I think, in conclusion, if we don't get HB 9 this year, then I think that will set back Alaska's gas line plans for 1 to 2 years, because these parties will not be on a parallel path, and we need that parallel path to keep both parties engaged, keep both projects moving. So I'll end there and take a few questions, but thank you for your attention. Thanks for being here on a sunny day too.